I'm going to welcome John Oudyk, our hygienist from OCOW in Hamilton, and also our most senior employee at OCOW, who just celebrated his 30th anniversary of leadership in health and safety at OCOW.
First of all, welcome to Ontario. I don't know, some of you are from out of province and may have not seen Ontario in the spring, but Carla, my partner, and I, we like to go biking in the wood along a bicycle path, and I took some of these pictures of spring flowers, so I thought we'd start off with these. These are bloodroot. These are trout lilies. They usually come yellow, but in our area along the Grand River, we have some white ones also, which are quite rare. And these are meadow beauty, and of course strawberries. And the red trillium. And Carla and I were in Montreal yesterday, and we were driving back, and as we were entering Ontario, we saw the sign, "Welcome to Ontario, open for business." So I thought that would be a good way to talk about stress, because the business case for stress, reducing stress in the workplace, is one of the strongest business cases you can come with. I'm sure many of you have heard the $51 billion before, the cost to the Canadian economy. Martin Sheen and a grad student of his actually worked that down and said that 3 to 11 billion of that 51 billion could actually be reduced, prevented by changes in the workplace. So that's an enormous business case for doing something about this. So outline, I'm just going to give a bit of a background first and then get right into the survey results. First of all, we're using the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire. We started off with version 2 and now we're into version 3, and because we want to keep the data together, and we have a bit of both, so we're a blended version of the two. Does the MIT COPSUC tool meet the CSA standard, the 13 psychosocial factors? And remember, there's actually a 14th, others identified by workers. And the long answer is yes, and the short answer is yes. And this is a mapping. You won't be able to read it, but I have this as a document with some explanation if you're interested. We've mapped them all to each of the 14. Plus we have an extra one, a 15th, where we actually have some health outcomes that we also use. Now these are a list of the factors. Again, I won't go into details because we'll be talking about the details later on. But this is the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire scales for the COPSUC 3. And these are the ones that were added by the mental injury tool group. And the way that happened was we started off with just the COPSUC 2 short version, and people kept saying, well, there's other stresses that this questionnaire isn't catching. So we kept adding and adding, and eventually we added all these. Some of them came from the longer COPSUC version. So what we like about the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire is it doesn't just focus on the individual. A lot of mental health in the workplace work today is focused on stigma and changing people's attitudes, which is good. You know, there's a place for each one of these, but what we find in the workplace is often missing is that we're dealing with primary prevention, looking at the source of the problems, the way they affect mental health in the workplace, and trying to make changes there. And that's where the COPSUC is the ideal tool to hit the cause of the problem. So in 2016, we did this survey, and we had over 4,000 respondents, and it was in English and French. It was for working Canadians and who were working with more than 5 employees in their workplace. We chose 5 employees because really, we can't use the survey in a workplace that's smaller than 5 employees. So practically, even though quite a large proportion of the Canadian workforce does work in workplaces with less than 5 people working there. So ECOS is a polling company, and they have a panel that they've randomly selected from the Canadian population. So with an adjustment with the labor force survey that StatsCan puts out, we can actually correlate our data and weight it so that it's representative to the Canadian population. We described those results from the 2016 survey at the CARWA conference in Toronto later that same year. And with the help of Peter Smith and Avi Ramakisson from the IWH, the Institute for Work and Health, we've been able to establish various validity and reliability measures for the instrument. And we just recently published a paper that describes that. It cost Val and the IWH, $3,500. So please go to the website and download it. So it's free access. We thought it was important because it's the validity and reliability of the instrument that's available. And it is technical, but there's always somebody who wants to know, is this a really valid or reliable instrument? And unfortunately, some of the other surveys that are available have not published it, so we thought it was important to publish it. We're also involved with an international group. This survey is used throughout the world by many, in many different countries. I think 28 languages it's been translated in. And 6 or 7 of those got together, and we all put our validation and reliability data together, and it will be published soon. Right now it's in review. I just got an email this morning saying by this afternoon I have to give them some more data in order to satisfy the reviewers, but it should be out soon. So now we have the 2019 survey. It was done in March of this year, and it was conducted in the same manner that the previous one was. There were a few slight adjustments to the survey, but not significant. And again, we're able to correlate this with the 2019 March StatsCan labor force survey. So for the statistical geeks, I'll leave this information. I won't go through it, but it's all there if you want to know what the numbers are. So here are the results. First of all, we have a general question that we ask: how would you rate the psychological health and safety climate in your workplace? Rating anywhere from healthy and supportive, good, fair, neutral, not so good, poor, toxic. And you can see that over 50% of people find their workplace psychological health and safety climate good or healthy and supportive. On the negative side, not so good, poor, or toxic adds up to about 19%. When we did it in 2016, this was 25%. So actually things seem to have improved. We asked people whether or not they had a violence and harassment policy in the workplace. This is cross Canada, not just Ontario, where there's a law that says you have to have it, but 85%. And whether or not their policy is effective, and there's only 15% that disagreed or strongly disagreed with that. However, when we broke down their opinion on the effectiveness of the violence and harassment policy by their experience of offensive behaviors, it's intuitively obvious, but the higher your experience of offensive behaviors, the lower your rating of the effectiveness of the health or violence and harassment policy. We also asked whether the organization tolerates has a culture that tolerates behaviors that harm mental health. And if you look at the last survey here, only 15% said that the violence and harassment policy was not effective. Yet when you add them up, 35% of people say that their organization tolerates mental health or behaviors that harm mental health. So there's a bit of a cognitive disconnect there. Maybe people are a little more positive when it comes to policy, but when it comes to experience, they have a slightly different view. Job satisfaction. Again, the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire includes the question about job satisfaction, which is often used in job satisfaction surveys. And 72% of people are either satisfied or very satisfied with their work, which is a very positive thing. In another parallel survey that we did on workplace exposures, we asked the question that we had in the previous 2016 survey about concerns about health and safety hazards or environmental conditions in the workplace. Anything from safety issues to working alone to dangerous chemicals, etc. And you can see that psychosocial hazards top the list, just like Ron had said from his survey. And this has been consistent for quite a few years. The steelworkers did a survey, an annual survey going back to the 80s on what the priorities of unions were for health and safety concerns, and stress was always number one. Some of the other Ontario results, this is just specifically to Ontario. 57% said they were, to a large extent or more, that they found their work meaningful and important, which is great. 43% said that to a large extent or more they felt recognized, appreciated, and treated fairly. 39% felt engaged in their workplace. And 37% said to a certain degree their work drains their energy and time so much that it causes a negative effect on their private life. So this is the work-life imbalance. Offensive behaviors. Sexual harassment, 12% of Ontario workers experienced sexual harassment in the past year. 16% experienced threats of violence. 11.5% experienced actual physical violence in the past year. 29% experienced bullying, which is down from the previous survey of about 34%. And 19% have reported some type of discrimination. We didn't define discrimination. We asked them, the respondents, to define what type of discrimination they received. And some of it would fit under human rights law, but some of it is things like favoritism and cliques in the workplace, things like that. And then respondents were also asked about whether they heard or witnessed these offensive behaviors done to somebody else other than themselves. And again, it was about 34%. And when we looked at the causes, where is it being perpetrated from? Those who experienced it from their supervisors or managers had the highest score for symptoms than those who experienced these offensive behaviors from a different perspective. And here's some of the results. You can see on the manager, superior, all red all the way down, whereas from clients and patients and customers, it's less. I think that's kind of expectation. You know, when you're working with people, you expect a certain amount of abuse. You don't expect it from your supervisor. We also looked at the correlation of the various factors, exposure factors, along with the symptoms, engagement, job satisfaction, work-life imbalance, and health and safety. So this is kind of a heat map. The stronger the color, the stronger the association. So for instance, with role conflicts, you can see that all symptoms has 3 pluses and is a darker color. You can also see that meaning of work and predictability are very strongly associated with engagement, as is recognition. So when you look at the Ontario results, the top correlations for symptoms was role conflicts, emotional demands, job insecurity, a lack of justice and respect, and a lack of recognition. For engagement, it's predictability, which is about communication, meaning of work, recognition again, possibility for development, and trust of management. Now let's compare some of the economic sectors. Yeah, okay. First of all, the survey was not designed to capture a representative sample of Canadian workers within an economic sector. It was overall. So some sectors which are very small, we have a lot of error, statistical error, and we correlated it back to the Canada Labour Force survey. And I'm not sure if you can see all these little numbers, but at the very end there, it shows the ratio. If the ratio is 1, then we've hit exactly a representative number. If it's less than 1, we've undersampled, and if it's over 1, we've oversampled. For instance, you have information, culture, and recreation, 2.26, so we've got more. So what ECOS does is they weight these to bring them back to a representative sample, but they only weight them on age, gender, and region, not on economic sector. So there is a certain bias in these results, and but some sectors are unbiased, but some are biased. And the amount of error in this, it was originally designed to have about a 1.5% error in your estimate of your score. So if you have a score, most scores are from 0 to 100, so if you have a score of 50, the error for the whole Canadian population is plus or minus 1.5%, which would be a range from 49 to 51 if the true value was 50, which is pretty tight. However, in small sectors such as agriculture, we have an 11% error. So if the actual number was 50, it could actually show up as 45 to 55. So you have to keep that in mind, that different sectors have different errors. Okay, here is the data, and I'll explain how this works. We have the economic sectors here, and then we have the scales, quantitative demands here, and it's a score anywhere from 0 to 100. The higher the score, the more the quantitative demands. So what we've done is take this row, and the lowest values are green, and the highest values are red, and the colors shaded in between. Anybody who knows Excel, Excel does this automatically. So we can see that wholesale trade, healthcare, and social assistance have the highest quantitative work demands, whereas transportation and warehousing, arts and entertainment, retail trade, other services are about 40, they're on the lower end. When it comes to work pace, however, you have a different picture. Here, food and accommodation has the highest rate, and the lowest, again, is with other services. You'll notice that for quantitative demands, the spread of the data from 41 to 49 is not as large as here from 54 to 76. So people are a lot more similar in quantitative demands, whereas work pace varies quite a bit across the economic sectors. When it comes to emotional demands, as expected, healthcare and social assistance are quite high. The next one up would be educational services. And the least, manufacturing, information technologies, and professional scientific services. Again, here you see quite a spread from 39 to 63. So, and work demands, this is a sum of the three, but you can see that this sum doesn't necessarily reflect all the changes within the work demand scales, the difference between quantitative demands, work pace, or emotional demands. When we come to work organization, we have a series here: influence, possibilities for development, meaning of work, and commitment to the workplace. Meaning of work and commitment to the workplace are kind of the engagement measures. And you can see right across the board here that transportation and warehousing is doing poorly. And also the retail trade is having its struggles, whereas healthcare and social assistance, when it comes to work organization, is doing quite well, except for influence. And again, construction is greenish shades right across. When it comes to work relationships, I had to break it down into 2 slides because there were so many scales. I think there's 8 of them. So predictability is about communication, whether you receive enough communication information to be able to do your job properly. Again, transportation and warehousing are doing quite rough in these first 2 scales. Accommodation and food services is doing quite well in many of these work relationship scales, even though the pace of work is quite high. Role conflict, administrative and support, waste management and remediation services. I don't know who dreamed up that name, but it's actually people who work in call centers and other support. When it comes to quality of leadership, transportation again, this is a common theme throughout last year too when we presented. However, educational services is interesting that their support is quite poor. Whereas food and accommodation, the support is very strong. When we look at job insecurity, interestingly, I don't know how many signs you see for truck drivers wanted, but you can see that there's very little job insecurity in the transportation and warehousing, but very little job satisfaction. I wonder if the 2 are related. Administrative, again, is quite tough in job insecurity, whereas the most secure is public administration, which probably a number of people in this room, including myself, although not so sure about that anymore. Work-life imbalance, construction has, and oil, gas, and quarry, mining has the worst. Again, other services are the best. Then we have these 2 values, trust of management, which is actually vertical trust, trust between the management and the workers, and justice and respect are combined and called social capital. This is an interesting concept that's used a lot in Europe to evaluate enterprises. And workplaces that have strong social capital are usually correlated with thriving organizations, whereas weak social capital are struggling. Public administration here is one of the worst, along with transportation. Educational services also. Again, food and accommodation, despite some of their challenges in their working conditions, seem to have a very good relationship between workers. And then we have the symptoms. Self-rated health is just, how would you rate your health? Fair, good, excellent, very good, or whatever. And educational services and public administration and other services are the weakest there. And the strongest are the outdoor work. Then you have the symptoms: burnout, stress, sleep troubles, somatic and cognitive symptoms. Again, despite all their great relationships in food and accommodation, and despite that they're usually younger age, they have a lot of symptoms. Wholesale trade, has trouble with sleep. But when you look at other services and arts and entertainment, they're with the least symptoms. Now, offensive behaviors. This one's quite interesting. I didn't use green because unless you have a 0, that's the only reason to have green, and so I only used the red color here. Undesired sexual attention, food and accommodations, and wholesale trade, health care are the higher ones. Educational services and other services is low. Threats of violence, health care, again, very high, along with construction, education services, and utilities. Physical violence, again, health care and education are high, along with construction. Bullying, here the highest is, the call center people, along with healthcare and wholesale trade are the highest. Discrimination, wholesale trade, again, very high, the least in other services. And vicarious offensive behaviors, again, a similar pattern. Now, we asked a few questions about culture in the workplace. Accident investigation focus, whether you look to blame somebody for an accident or you look to find the cause. And the blame orientation is strongest in accommodations and food, whereas the looking for a cause is the strongest in other and professional and arts and entertainment and educational service. Hitting the wrong button. The effectiveness of the violence and harassment policy. The best in agriculture, forestry, and fishing, and the worst in wholesale trade, educational services, healthcare, and also public administration. The psychological health and safety climate is best in forestry and agriculture, utilities, construction, finance, and insurance, and the worst in healthcare and the call center people and transportation and housing. And the culture that tolerates harmful behaviors, education is the worst of the bunch, and food and accommodations the best, which is somewhat contradictory, I think, to some of the other readings. These are some of the demographics. I won't go into them, but it shows you the educational level of the different sectors, the average age category, the percentage management in the sample that we had, whether or not they were full-time. You can see arts and entertainment is very part-time work, whereas utilities seems to be the most full-time. And unpaid extra hours per week and average hours per week. You should look at these two together. And when you look at the two together, you look at mining, quarrying, gas and oil extraction, 48 hours average plus an extra 6 hours unpaid on top of that. So you're looking at 54 hours a week. Construction also very high. Educational services has the lowest hours per week, but also the highest unpaid hours. Okay, so that's a bit of what we've seen so far. We're still working on this. We need to connect this one to the last survey. We actually have about over 600 people who filled out both surveys, so we're going to look at a longitudinal analysis of that with the help of Peter Smith, the IWH. We also are going to keep working with the international network for the COPSUC users. We're wondering if every 3 years we should repeat this survey, and we're wondering if there are any interested co-sponsors here, if you're interested in some of these results. And leave it open for any comments or questions about the data. I answered on, yes?
So John, if our organization, as you know, took the survey twice, the 2016 one.
Yeah.
If we would plan to do the 2019 one, I believe in January, to repeat it, what are some factors that we would have to look for? We talked about differences between the two when we're comparing the 2016 results to the 2019 as an organization. Is there anything that we have to be mindful of?
Okay, the new set of results, which we will be using as a comparison population, are a little bit better on average than the other ones. So we'll be raising the bar slightly. So it'll be, however, Alan Powell from the CCOHS is here, and he's the one who's programming it. And when they forced me to, put it down in numbers, which ones are changing, I was surprised. I think the changes were maybe 5% of the categories actually changed, and the change was very slight. So it's pretty well the same. There's a slight up, but as the Canadian environment improves, I think it's appropriate that the bar does go up a little along with everyone else. Yes. They're asking whether the ECOS panels would include temporary foreign workers or people who have language issues. Yes, obviously, if they can't be recruited by the ECOS recruiters, which means you're in some kind of a database of phone numbers and addresses and things like that, you won't be there. And obviously, if you can't understand the recruiters, you won't be included even if they can't contact you. Goes the same for homeless, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, social capital is the combination of trust and justice and respect in a workplace. And they've done a lot of studies where they've measured social capital in a workplace and measured the effectiveness of the organization. And it's been, they've seen a strong correlation that if you have good trust and respect and justice in the workplace, that your organization is a stronger organization and more effective in doing what it wants to do as an organization. In Europe, they look at these surveys as an organizational development tool. They don't. In Europe, there's a law that actually says you have to do these surveys on a regular basis, usually every 2 years. And the more innovative and flexible companies have been using this to as a positive thing rather than as looking at the negatives. So they're looking at engagement, job satisfaction, and things like that, and trying to use the tool to see, what things can we do to strengthen this organization, rather than look at, I have to comply with a law that says I have to do this. So there's a really neat book called Positive Organizational Psychology that's available. It was written, I think, 2-3 years ago, and it's a summary of that approach to a more positive, using these surveys as a building tool rather than an evaluation tool or a risk. Instead of focusing on the risk, you focus on the opportunities. How do I say it? Okay, I'm going to repeat it the way I understood. Well, maybe I'll just give the answer and then hopefully. When we do this in a workplace, when we use it, we benchmark their results to these results. And so you can see how you can compare. We also use an internal comparison where we correlate the risk factors with the symptoms. And then, so there's a number of different comparisons that we use, because some people feel that, for instance, I often find with teachers, they only want to be compared with teachers, which can be a good thing if you're just comparing school board to school board. But if you're comparing the amount of, for instance, violence in the workplace is quite high. So the background level in that sector is quite high. So if you compare it to that, then it doesn't seem as bad an issue as if you compared it to the scientific economic sector, where it's very low. So comparisons are really tricky, and that's why we put most of our emphasis on the internal comparison. So what are your people's symptoms correlated with? Which factors? Because, you know, for instance, if you're a jail guard, you're used to violence, and it may not keep you up at night, but if you don't have the backup of your manager and your colleagues, that is really critical for jail guards. We did a big study with jail guards, so, but so it depends on which sector you're in, whereas violence in the healthcare sector is really offensive because you're trying to help people, and how do you get thanked? A slap in the face. It's tough. So.